In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the especially merciful. In this video, we'll be discussing the most important topic and subject that desperately needs to be discussed and to be talked about. And most sheikhs and most da'is and most Muslims have not addressed this subject and did not discuss it due to fear or due to fear of being blamed or accused of something that they said that they didn't mean in that way, since the subject is a sensitive subject and a risky subject to discuss. Also, most Muslims don't discuss it due to carelessness for Islam and simple lack of knowledge, since the average Muslim doesn't even know the very basics of Islam. They cannot go as deep as to discuss this subject. Although this subject is simple and basic, it's too advanced for the average Muslim to be able to discuss, because the average Muslim doesn't even have the most essential basic knowledge. And I consider this subject a essential basic knowledge, but they don't even have even less and even more basic than this subject. And this subject is the subject of and the accusation made by the bigots mainly to say that Islam allows extremism and Islam allows terrorism and promotes it. And my reply to that, and the Islamic reply to that, is that's false. That's not true. And we'll be discussing the most common modern day Islamic misconception in this video. And I'll not only prove that this is false with evidences from the Quran and Sunnah, but I'll also show the evidences that the accusers use to make this claim. I'll be reading the various verses that the bigots use from the Quran to make their accusation. Now what follows is the verses that the bigots use to make their claim, and as to claim that Islam allows terror and promotes it. The first verse they use is, "And kill them wherever you find them, and expel them from where they have expelled you, and their trials is worse than killing." This is verse 2. This is chapter 2, verse 191 of the Quran. The second verse that the bigots use to make their claim: "And fight against them until there is no more fitna, and until the religion is for Allah alone." This is verse 8. This is chapter 8, verse 39 in the Quran. The next verse: "It is not for a prophet to have captives of war until he inflicts a massacre in the land. You Muslims desire the commodities of this world, but Allah desires for you the hereafter. But Allah desires for you the hereafter." This is chapter 8, verse 69. And chapter 9, verse 5 says, "And when the invaluable months have passed, then kill the polytheists wherever you find them, and capture them, and besiege them at every place of ambush. But if they should repent, establish prayer, and give zakah, let them go their way. Indeed, Allah is forgiving and merciful." The next verse: "Fight them. Allah will punish them by your hands, and He will disgrace them, and give you victory over them, and satisfy the breasts of a believing people." Chapter 9, verse 13. And there are multiple other verses in the Quran with similar teaching. And there are other hadith with similar teaching as well. Now, as we can see, there are multiple verses about war in the Quran. But can we really understand those verses without reading the entire chapter or the entire section of the verse, and without knowing the reason the verses were sent and why? The simple answer is no. You all remember in English class that our teachers would always say you must read the entire chapter or section of a verse or of a sentence in order to know the full meaning of what's really being said and to really know the context of what's being said. So why would that be any different with the Quran? Also, we need to know the reason why the verses were sent. And that's made clear in hadiths. And I can prove that this mythology that the bigots use towards Islam and towards the Quran is a nonsensical, non-practical, non-logical mythology, and I will use the Bible to prove it. What follows are verses from the Bible that speaks about fighting and war. The first verse. Suppose you hear in one of the towns the Lord your God has given you, that some worthless ramble among the fellow citizens, some worthless ramble among you have led their fellow citizens astray by encouraging them to worship foreign gods. In such cases, you must examine the facts carefully. If you find it's true and you can prove that such a detestable act has occurred among you, you must attack that town and completely destroy all of the inhabitants, as well as all of the livestock. Then you must pile all the plunder in the middle of the street and burn it, put the entire town to the torch as a burnt offering to the Lord your God. This is in Deuteronomy 13, chapter 13, verse 13 through 19. And by the way, some of the verses in the Old Testament, which is considered part of the Bible, which is considered the Bible, the first 5 chapters of the Old Testament is also considered the Torah. So the Jews who accuse the Muslims of being extremists and terrorists, this is what your Torah teaches: to kill people who leave your religion. The next verse. If your own full brother, or your son, or your daughter, or your beloved wife, or your intimate friend entices you secretly to serve other gods, whom you and your fathers have not known, gods of any other nation, near at hand or far away, from one end of the earth to the other, do not yield to them, or listen to him, nor spare them, nor look with pity upon them, to spare or shield them, but kill them. Kill them. Deuteronomy, verse 13, chapter 13, verse 7 through 12. Again, part of the Torah. This verse is in the Torah and in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Next verse. The Lord then gave these further instructions to Moses. Tell the people of Israel to keep my Sabbath day, for the Sabbath is a sign of the covenant between me and you forever. It helps you to remember me, that I am the Lord who makes you holy. Yes, keep the Sabbath day, for it is holy. Anyone who desecrates it must die. Exodus 31, verse 12 through 15. Now the Christians will be quick to say these are all Old Testament. We don't follow the Old Testament. We don't follow the Old Testament, and we don't follow the Old Testament laws. Bring us something from the New Testament. Well, here's something from the New Testament, and Jesus' own words, according to the Bible. In the New Testament, he said, "Do not suppose I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace. I have come with nothing but the sword." This is Matthew 10, verse 34. Now, if the Christians were to say, that all those verses of the Old Testament are all expired, and they're all outdated, and we don't follow the Old Testament laws. Jesus came with the New Testament, the New Covenant. Well, according to Jesus' own words, he said, "I have not come to cancel the laws of the prophets, not so much of a stroke of the pen, not so much as a stroke of the pen of the law of the prophets will be cancelled by any means until heavens and earth pass away. This is your Jesus in your New Testament saying that not even a stroke of the laws of the prophets will be cancelled by any means until heavens and earth pass away, which means Old Testament laws according to Jesus is still valid law. Therefore, Jesus indicates that he approves of the Old Testament law. That's the first point. The second point is, you believe Jesus is God. Yes? Who revealed the Old Testament laws? Was it not God revealing it to Moses and the other prophets before him? According to the first chapter in the Old Testament, it says these laws were revealed by God to Moses. Revealed by God. Now who is God? According to the Christians, isn't it Jesus? Your Jesus? Therefore your Jesus is the one who revealed those laws according to you. Because you say Jesus is God. Therefore Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. Therefore Jesus is the one who revealed the Old Testament laws, because you believe Jesus is God. That's the second point. Now if the Christians were to say these verses are all cherry-picked verses, especially the last one, where Jesus says, do not suppose I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace. I have come with nothing but the sword. They will be saying, no, that's cherry-picked. He didn't mean it that way. It's taken out of context. He was talking metaphorically. He didn't intend it to be taken in that simple way. Well, that's the point. I hope the point is clear. Just like that verse is not to be taken out of context. And I agree, that verse is taken out of context. The other verses are not, actually. The Old Testament verses, when you read the context, it actually means to kill people who leave their religion. The verses in the Old Testament, it actually means to kill them. Yes, it says that in its context. But the verses of Jesus, particularly that verse, indeed is taken out of context. I agree. Because he meant it in a metaphorical way. Why? Because he was given examples before and after. So it sounded like he was he meant it in a metaphorical way, because he said later on that the sword is the religion, and that people will be fighting each other, not literally, but as like fighting each other with their religion, like, but not literally. So it sounded like he meant it in a metaphorical way when you read the context. So likewise, just like you need to read that verse as context to know the meaning, the same thing applies to the Quranic verses. The same thing. So now, you don't have to take my word for it. Let's go back to those verses. Let's go back to those Quranic verses and simply read one verse before the verses in question. Just one. And let's see if it makes it any more clear. One verse before the first verse that we discussed, the first killing verse of the Quran that we discussed. Let's read just one verse before it. It says, fight in the way of Allah those who fight against you, but do not transgress. Indeed, Allah does not like the transgressors. Then the verse the bigots use comes after it. And kill them wherever you find them, and expel them from where they have expelled you, and their trials is worse than killing. The verse is made perfectly clear who is to be taken and killed wherever you find them. It's clear now. Those who fight against you. Now if the Christians were to say, well, Islam has a concept that you must defend yourself or you must fight, and Christianity doesn't have that concept. Christianity simply says, turn the other cheek and don't fight the aggressors. Don't fight your enemy. Love your enemies. Love your oppressors. It's a better mythology. It's a better system. Better and more peaceful than Islam. It sounds good on paper, but practically it cannot be applied. It cannot possibly be applied, and I'll prove it. If a person, a Muslim, was to come and shoot you and your family and your children and take your wife and rape her, would you smile and say, peace and love, love and peace, let's hug and sing together? No. You would be angry and enraged, and you would want to get revenge. you would defend yourself, or you would try to defend yourself. If Muslims by the masses came to take over your country and invade and implement Sharia law, would you smile and say, peace and love, love and peace, let's all sing along and get together? No. You would try to defend yourself. And Christians do not apply the concept of turning the other cheek. They're the least one who apply that. So let's not lie to yourself. And let's not claim things that are not logical or not practical. Turning the other cheek is considered allowing the oppressor to oppress. It doesn't work. You can't have an oppressor oppress you and you just smile and let them continue oppressing. They're not going to stop. If it's possible to do it, then the Christians should be the first ones to apply that method. And as we can see, Iraq War, Afghan War, other wars, you have never applied that method. You have never applied it, and you never do apply it. If you apply it, why are you so bigoted towards Islam? Why do you keep on attacking Islam and insulting Islam? Clearly, you don't apply that method. You don't apply that method because it cannot be applied. It's not possible and it's not logical. Now let's go to the second verse in question that we mentioned in the beginning. And let's just read one verse, just one verse, before the verse in question from the Quran. It says, say to those who have disbelieved that if they seize what has previously occurred will be forgiven for them. But if they return to hostility, then the precedent of the former peoples has already taken place. Then the verse in question comes, and fight against them until there is no more trials from them, and until the religion, all of it, is for Allah. And if they seize, then indeed Allah is seeing of what they do. Chapter 8, verse 39 of the Quran. So it's made clear. And fight against them until there's no more trials. Who's them? Say to those who have disbelieved, if they seize what has previously occurred. What has previously occurred? When this verse was sent, it was war. They attacked on the Muslims. And you can find this by reading the reason the verses were sent. Unlike the Christians, we have the reasons. We know how and why the verses were sent. So we can understand what's being intended and what's really being said and what's God really trying to instruct us to do, because we know the reason the verses were sent. And that's found in the Hadith. Now, this is the first part of this topic. We'll be continuing part 2 in the next episode. I'll conclude with, may the peace and blessings be on the Prophet Muhammad and on all those who follow him until the last day.